Oui, ça me stresse. C'est quoi ça? Pardon. Tout rien. Ça va, c'est bien ton stage?
Du coup, je vais...
Ah, il me semblait que tu avais déjà commencé la semaine
J'avais un
dernière.
rendez-vous, ouais.
Ah, ok.
On parlait un peu de ce qu'on avait fait, donc vraiment, c'est la première fois.
C'est dans une UMJC, c'est ça?
C'est ça.
Laquelle?
L'association. Je suis en train de réfléchir.
Inconnu bataillon.
Il y a 15 minutes d'ici, là-bas.
Ah, juste.
Est-ce qu'il y a des nouveaux étudiants par rapport aux semaines précédentes ou pas? Non, je ne peux pas la faire. Non, mais c'est important. Hein. Si vous n'étiez pas là les semaines précédentes, il faut vraiment que je vérifie que vous êtes sur la bonne liste, parce qu'après, il y aura des problèmes pour les examens, c'est tout. Non? C'est bon? Même les Erasmus. Tout le monde a bien accès aux cours en ligne maintenant? Oui, les Erasmus y compris? Oui, mais si vous m'avez envoyé un mail, il faut que je vous inscris, comme je l'avais dit. Ah ben voilà, si vous me l'envoyez, je vous le mettrai tout de suite. Hein. Vous n'avez pas besoin d'être inscrite encore. Je peux vous donner un accès tout de suite. Donc il suffit, vous m'envoyez un mail dès que vous pouvez et je vous ajouterai. Ah, c'est important que vous puissiez avoir accès au texte, même si je les projette, c'est vrai que c'est important de pouvoir y avoir accès. Alors on va juste commencer avant de se concentrer donc sur, on va passer 3 semaines sur, donc j'ai dit, ça se diviserait en 3 grandes parties. La première chose, d'entrer dans la sphère publique, en tout cas dans la sphère visible du public bourgeois, de tous ceux qu'on appelait les aliens à l'époque, donc les étrangers. On va donc se concentrer sur l'immigration et la manière dont elle était perçue. On va commencer aujourd'hui, on va travailler pendant 3 semaines dessus. Ensuite, on travaillera sur la perception de la pauvreté, donc la nouvelle visibilité de la pauvreté. Et les 4 dernières séances du cours, elles seront sur la perception de l'entrée de la femme dans l'espace public. Mais avant de commencer cette partie-là, je voulais qu'on revienne... On était en train, la semaine dernière, et on n'avait pas tout à fait terminé, de travailler sur quelques textes d'introduction, on va dire. Donc on avait vu quelques exemples de perception de la femme à l'époque, quand elle a commencé à être dans la sphère... Pourquoi je parle en français, moi, aujourd'hui? Je ne sais pas. Non mais je mélange parce que j'ai un cours en civilisation que je fais en français parce que c'est pour les bilingues, alors de temps en temps je... Well, sorry. Yeah, and we had read 2 descriptions by George Augustus Sala, describing women for the first time in omnibuses, and describing women in a way that makes women kinds of decorations, in a way, kinds of decorations in the urban landscape or in the cityscape. So the two extracts are quite telling from this respect. And then I had also included, and this was also part of my introduction before focusing on each group individually, I also included a series of letters, also dating back to the period before the one we studied, that is when women started little by little, very slowly, to enter the public sphere. So these letters written to the Times, to the editor of the Times, were written in the 60s, the early 60s, that is the mid-Victorian period. And they are very characteristic of the debates which could go on at the time about the presence of women, very often young women, in the public sphere, as they were the first to enter the public sphere. And here you have a pater familias, as he calls himself, pater familias from the provinces. And apparently he's come to London for the day, and with his family, and they visited London, and he's going to explain his impression when he went to London. So I've just come with my family from a large provincial town to reside in London, and was a good deal surprised to learn from several friends here that I must be guarded in permitting my daughters, just out of their teens, to walk in the parks or even go a-shopping without protection in the shape of a servant or one of their brothers, younger or old, as London was infested by a number of ill-conditioned blackguards who made it a business to insult and terrify young ladies by following them and even being daring enough at times to attempt to speak to them. I confess I was so incredulous about such cowardly lasciviousness that at times that I did not think it necessary to interdict my girls from walking, even in pairs, without some protection. But tonight on my return home, I was roused to no ordinary pitch of indignation when one of my younger daughters, who had been shopping with a relative of hers, a lady upwards of 30 years of age, told me that in Oxford Street, a young fellow in the garb of a gentleman kept walking before and behind them alternately for some time, and at last had the audacity to come alongside and make some observation when the ladies took shelter in a stationer's shop and the genteel ruffian immediately disappeared. Now, sir, I appeal to you to give publicity to my complaint in order that it may direct attention to this deplorable phase of London life, and probably the scoundrels may dread the possibility of exposure, etc., etc. So you see here, what is quite interesting here is that obviously the tone is full of indignation. The way the father speaks of the young men who dared speak to his daughters is very almost aggressive. He calls them scoundrels, ruffians, etc. But in fact, what happened, according to his description, what did the young man do to his daughters?
Young man in that time in London follows the young girls.
Yes, he followed them, and did he insult them? Did he?
No,
Apparently not. He just
tried
talked.
to observe.
Yeah, just tried to talk to them. So the very notion of talking to a young lady that you didn't know if you were a man was, of course, at the time, especially if the young lady was from the middle class, of course, the middle class or the aristocracy, was something very, very shocking for this father. And you see here, he seems to be underlying the difference between London, in which probably it was more dangerous for a woman to walk in the streets on their own, and the large provincial town where he came from, where apparently it was less dangerous to leave your daughters on their own in the streets. So this is what he calls cowardly insults to the ladies. But of course, when we read this, it just seems that the man was trying to speak to the ladies, but we don't know much about this. And from this testimony, several readers of the Times answered, and this is one of the answers, for instance. Sir, in answer to the general accusation brought against my countrymen by your correspondent in the Times of today, allow me to say a few words in their defense by recording my own experience. During the last 18 months, I've been in the constant habit of traversing Oxford Street alone, circumstances preventing my being able to procure an escort in the shape of a brother or a servant, and never have I received the slightest incivility from my chivalrous countrymen. Young ladies from the country, being anxious to discover what headdress is most fashionable, or to what degree of circumference the present style of dress extends, will walk down Oxford Street dressed in red cloaks and pork pie hats, with white feathers, a dress most suitable for the country, but hardly consistent with the quiet demeanour necessary for walking in the streets of London. They cannot expect to escape the notice of those few despicable idlers, unworthy the name of men, who take advantage of the weakness of women, whom they ought to feel it their duty to protect. And this is signed Puella, apparently a girl, well, we don't know exactly who she is, she doesn't give a full name. So here you still have the kind of difference which is stressed between life in the countryside and life in a city like London. And especially the stress is on what here? She's a woman speaking, but what is she implying? Yes, she's implying that if you dress with bright colors or white feathers on your hat, then it's no surprise that you are being harassed in the streets of London. So she stresses at the same time the fact that country girls may not be able to adjust to life in London, and this is the reason why, as if it was acceptable, this is the reason why they were being harassed in the streets of London. So there was a whole discussion, a whole debate on this, whether the way women were dressed excused, in a way, the attitude of men or not. Well, this is still a debate today, by the way. This has not much changed. And then you have the pater familias answering, saying that, well, I can assure her that my ladies were not attired in pork pies with white feathers and scarlet cloaks, but in plain mourning, like all loyal people at such a time. I should be glad to learn that the general experience of ladies residing in the city, etc., etc. So you had many debates, I would say, at the time, many debates on this new presence of women in the streets. It was really the beginning of the visibility of, let's say, respectable women, as they were called, that is, women from the middle class and from the upper classes in the streets. As you see from the letters, most of them, when they went into the streets, were accompanied by a servant, a father, a brother, a husband, a chaperon, as they were called. And when they were not, they attracted the attention of passers-by, or they thought they attracted the attention of passers-by. And you have, but we'll study this when we focus on this group of women, you had many books, almost guidebooks, which explained to young women how not to look directly at men in the streets, how to look at your feet when you were walking in the streets of London, and certainly not gaze in men's eyes directly. So it was a whole education of girls, a whole education to teach them to penetrate, in a way, the public sphere. Because this was, at least in the 1960s, this was not something usual. This was something that had to be taught. This was not the natural place for women, as we saw when we read what Ruskin, for instance, thought about it. The last point I wanted to make to complete what we said last time was about the third group becoming visible in the second part of the 19th century, especially aliens. And I have just included, and we'll look at it very rapidly because we're going to focus on this group in this lesson. I have included for this another text by George Augustus Sala, still taken from Gaslight and Daylight, which is a description of London life at the time. So it's 1859, so mid-Victorian period, before the period we're going to focus on. And this is a description of perfidious Patmos, as he calls it. And perfidious Patmos is a metaphor that he uses. Do you know Patmos? It's a Greek island. And it's a Greek island which is particularly famous for having been invaded several times by different types of populations. And here, obviously, Patmos refers to all the immigrants who live in the part of London he's describing. And the adjective, of course, is very negative, perfidious, which seems to be implying something almost dangerous, dangerous but not openly dangerous. So there's already a very negative bias in the title itself. And he describes a part of London. Dr. Johnson called London the common sewer of Paris and of Rome. But at the present day, it is a reservoir, a giant vat, into which flow countless streams of continental immigration. And you see here the vocabulary that he uses. First, the reference to the sewer. Well, it's not his words, it's Dr. Johnson's words. So it's words taken from the past, when Dr. Johnson was still alive. The common sewer of Paris and of Rome. You understand what a sewer is?
No.
Yeah? All of you?
No.
No, c'est un égout.
Oh,
An égout. The common sewer of Paris and Rome. And then he more or less changes the word for reservoir, which is a little less negative, a giant vat, but into which flow countless streams of continental immigration. And then you have this idea of invasion of immigrants through the very usual metaphor of the streams of, or the flux of immigration. And he's going to quote some of them. The Germans to become tailors, the Swiss to become valets and house porters, the United States with Irish, English, and as in the United States, Irish, English, and Germans. The artistic population with French, Swiss, German governesses, French painters, Italian singers, musicians, French hairdressers, milliners, etc. So all the jobs that corresponded to these communities, because very often at the time each community was specialized in a particular job. So the Germans, you had especially had German governesses, especially had French hairdressers, etc., etc. There is the immense foreign servile population, French and Italian valet, shopmen, German nurses, nursery maids. The foreign commercial population and a whole colony of Greek merchants in Finsbury, of Germans in the Minories, of Frenchmen around Austin Friars, of Moorish Jews in Whitechapel, and of foreign shopkeepers at the west end of the town. So this is what I would call white immigration most of the time, or what they called white immigration at the time, not colored immigration. He doesn't say much about this type of immigration, except about their jobs. And then he passes to the foreign mendicant population, German and Alsatian buy-a-broom girls, so probably they sold brooms, les balais, Italian hurdy-gurdy grinders, French begging letter writers, etc., etc. So the mendicants, the beggars. And then he's going to focus on the foreign population, the foreign maritime population, an enormous one. There is the foreign, and then he is going to classify this population. There is the foreign respectable population, composed of strangers, well-to-do, who prefer English living and English customs to those of their own country. And then there is the foreign swindling population, aliens who live on their own wits and on the want thereof of their neighbours, sham counts, barons or chevaliers, farmers of German lotteries, speculators of German university degrees, etc., etc. There's the foreign visiting or sightseeing population. So all the first paragraph is about more or less white immigration. And it's only later that is going to focus on another type of immigration. But it's later in the text, and I'm not sure I have included it here. Yeah. A trapezium of streets enclosed within this boundary are not by any means of an aristocratic description. A maze of sorry thoroughfares, a second-rate butcher's meat and vegetable market, 2 model lodging houses, a dingy parish church, and some brick barns of dissent are within its boundaries. No lords or squires of high degree live in this political Alsatia. The houses are distinguished by a plurality of bell pulls inserted in the door jambs and by a plurality of little brass nameplates bearing the names of indwelling artisans. Everybody seems to be married and to have a great many children whose education appears to be conducted chiefly on the outdoor principle. As an uninterested stranger and without a guide, you might, perambulating these shabby streets, see in them nothing which would particularly distinguish them from that class of London vanes known inelegantly but expressively as back slums. At the first glance, you see nothing but dingy houses teeming with that sallow cabbage stalk and fried fish sort of population, indigenous to black slums. The pinafore children are squabbling or playing in the gutters, while from distant courts come faintly and fitfully threats of Jane to tell Anne's mother, together with that unmeaning monotonous chant or dirge which street children sing, why or with what object I know not. Grave dogs sit on their doorsteps, their heads patiently cocked on one side, waiting for the door to be opened, as in this region of perpetual beer fetching, they know must soon be the case. The beer itself, in vases of strangely diversified patterns and borne by heaves of a diversified appearance, is incessantly threading the needle through narrow courts and alleys. The public house doors are always on the swing. The bakers' shops, they mostly sell seconds, are always full. So are the cook shops. So are the coffee shops. Step into one, and you shall have a phase of Patmos before you incontinent. I don't understand the before you incontinent. I'm not sure I understand this. Well, it's 19th century syntax. Yeah, what are these aliens, as he calls them? And you see that, and this will be very important to understand in the perception of foreigners at the time, he makes a distinction between 2 types of foreigners. And this distinction is made on which basis?
Isn't it about those who work and those who don't?
Well, it's especially those who maybe, yeah, well, some of them do work, but they have, let's say, lower types of jobs. But it's true. It's on the basis of their education and on the basis of their wealth, I would say. Mm-hmm. You have the respectable, in a way, the respectable foreigners on the one hand, and he describes them in a quite neutral way. And he even says that they are quite well accepted. And there is what he calls, and you see that he's going to call them aliens. The other category is called aliens. And immediately there is a negative bias in aliens. And the aliens are in fact associated with what other group of the British population?
Poor one,
the poor ones, yeah, absolutely. And you'll see, yeah, you'll see that the process of othering at the time, that is of seeing some parts of the population as others, will work exactly in the same way as far as the poor are concerned or foreigners are concerned. They were really associated at all levels, and visiting, for instance, visiting the slums was exactly like visiting the heart of Africa for a Victorian gentleman at the time. And you see here how he explains that there is a complete similarity between the places where aliens live, and he uses the word aliens, whereas for the respectable foreigners he used the word foreigner. And you see the fact of using alien further others this class of people. They are alien, that is, they are not like us. Whereas foreigner is much more neutral, you see. So the very fact of using alien is already very telling. And when he describes them, when he describes their life in the streets, he immediately says that there is no difference between these aliens and the English poor. And the description he gives of them is exactly the same he would give about the English poor. That is, describing a street, people by English people in the East End of London, for instance. He would have used exactly the same vocabulary. He would have used exactly the same images. The children in the streets, the women yelling at them, the fact that they spend their days in the streets instead of being at home or instead of being at work, etc., etc. Yeah, so this is, well, I've not analyzed with you the first three articles which are about the theory of the public sphere. You'll read them, but they are not part of the exam at the end of the year. Only this one, for weeks 1 to 2, only the one by Judith Wolkowitz may be part of your exam. The other ones are very theoretical articles, which I've included because some of their passages are interesting to understand the construction of the notion of the public sphere, as we explained it last time, but they are rather a background reading. They are not part of the curriculum. The article by Judith Wolkowitz, on the contrary, is a very important part of the curriculum, so you will have to read it very, very thoroughly. I just like, it's an article on urban spectatorship. That is the fact of exploring the city. The fashion there was in the 19th century, and this is why we have so many testimonies from the late 19th century, the second part of the 19th century, witnessing, in fact, life as it was perceived to be by these urban explorers. Be careful about the fact that it's not because urban explorers said something about a place that it was necessarily the truth. It was their perception of the truth. And very often, we know today that many urban explorers of the time, well, most of them were white, educated men, white bourgeois men, most of them. You also have some testimonies from women, but as we will see, there were fewer of them. So as you had the point of view of white bourgeois men, obviously you had a bias in most of these texts. They were describing women in the public sphere from their male bourgeois point of view. They were describing the poor in the public sphere from their male bourgeois point of view. And of course, the distance there was between themselves and women, or between themselves and foreigners, or between themselves and the poor, explains that what we have in these testimonies are just the way they perceived people, right? They can't be seen as a historical account of the actual situation of these people. So this is very important. And Judith Wolkowitz explains this notion of urban spectatorship, this new fashion in the second part of the 19th century to explore big cities. To explore big cities because big cities were new almost new territories. The development of big city was something relatively new, something dating back to the beginning of the 19th century. And these urban explorers, as they are now called, well, a very good example of an urban explorer would be Charles Baudelaire in France. Well, in France we call them the flâneur, Charles Baudelaire, and the French, they don't use the word urban explorers, but the word flâneur. That is typically a white male bourgeois or educated man walking in the streets of a big city and just looking around and describing what he sees or what he perceives, right? And at a time when the city was almost a new geographical territory, an unknown geographical territory, it was a way to better grasp, the nature of city life. At a time when city life was, especially in very big cities, which did not exist before, London had grown by, I think the population was multiplied by 8 or 10 in 1 century, which is absolutely phenomenal. So it was a way of grasping the nature of the city, and the city was very often seen as a kind of, one of the great metaphors about the city in these texts is the city as a kind of labyrinth, The city as a labyrinth, same word in French, the city as a kind of maze in which you could get lost because it was so big, there was the image of the labyrinth, of the maze, there was the image of the spider web as well. The city sprawling, like a spider web and becoming bigger and bigger. And very often the city was also associated with the image of the monster. Henry James, the American author, but he lived in London for many years, Henry James called it, and this is the title of Judith Wolkowitz's text, comes from Henry James's metaphor. He called it the dreadful, delightful city. The dreadful, delightful city. Well, the fact of using dreadful and delightful in the same phrase to refer to something is, of course, what is it called in literature? Dreadful, delightful. An oxymoron, yeah. It's typically an oxymoron. The two adjectives normally don't go together, except that Henry James explains here that this city with its immensity, its maze-like streets, like a spider web with a maze of streets, mysterious streets. At the time, not all streets had light, for instance, electricity. So sometimes it was very dark, especially in the East End of London. So he explains that his experience of the city was a dreadful, delightful experience. That is, and you're going to feel this in most texts of the time describing the city and describing the population, the new groups in the cityscape. That is, this ambivalent impression of both fascination and fear, fascination and repulsion. The dialectics of fascination and repulsion is going to be very strong whenever you read testimonies by white bourgeois men describing women in the public sphere, foreigners in the public sphere, and the poor in the public sphere. So the dreadful, delightful city is a particularly telling expression. And this is another expression used by Henry James. He called London a strangely mingled monster. A strangely mingled monster. To refer to this mixture of people from all social classes, this mixing between genders, this mixing between nationalities, this mixing between all types of people in the public sphere that could not be observed in the same way, of course, in a village or in the countryside, in which the community was more closely knit. So this idea of the strangely mingled monster, you know, like a Frankenstein's monster made up of different pieces, and a kind of patchwork monster. This is how he saw London. But at the same time, he was attracted to London, and he spent 20, 30 years there. So he loved London, but he was also afraid of London, especially at the beginning. And he explains in an essay on London that he wanted to tame this monster. He had to explore the city, to tame the monster, and to get more familiar with the monster. And the last image he uses, or one of the last images he uses, is the ogress who devours human flesh to keep herself alive, to do her tremendous work. So this impression of London as a monster, London as a maze, London as a spider web, London as dreadful and delightful at the same time, London as strangely mingled, and London as an ogress. That is, this idea that London attracted people to its heart, but then many people were devoured by London. Those who fell into prostitution, for instance, or those who fell under the poverty line, because they had been attracted from the countryside to London, and then they didn't find the life they expected in London. So these images by Henry James are particularly interesting to have in mind when we study the three groups of people that we'll study. What Wolkowitz also notes, which is very important to keep in mind, is that in all these accounts that we're going to read about foreigners, about women, about the poor especially, there is a streak, an important streak of voyeurism. And I was just speaking of this dialectics, this ambivalent feeling of attraction-repulsion, but voyeurism is also this. Voyeurism is looking at something, but very often without wanting the others to know that you're looking at something, because you're a little ashamed in a way, but also attracted at the same time. So in almost all these accounts that we'll read, and we'll read some of them about, for instance, the perception of Irish people, Jewish people, etc., you will immediately feel this notion of voyeurism. There is, in almost all of them, a notion of voyeurism. The male bourgeois, the white male bourgeois, is going to gaze at the spectacle of the city, a new spectacle, because new actors are entering the public sphere. And they're going to discover this new spectacle, this new panorama, in a way. Wordsworth called London a moving pageant, c'est-à-dire un spectacle animé, a moving pageant. So the notion of spectatorship was really closely associated with big cities, and especially London at the time, the moving pageant. So a notion of voyeurism, as we've said, and she also explained, you see here, the Flaner's propensity for fantasy. As illusionist, the Flaner transformed the city into a landscape of strangers and secrets. As illusionist, the Flaner transformed the city into a landscape of strangers and secrets. And this is exactly what you'll see in these testimonies of white male bourgeois of the time. Exactly as you remember the picture in Slummibus, in which the rich, the educated, are gazing at the poor, and they're either surprised, disgusted, a little afraid, and they obviously other the poor. They consider the poor as others, as well as the poor consider them as others. So this is very ironical, of course. But you'll see that each time in the text, there's this notion of voyeurism, but also this notion of mystery. as if they were discovering a completely new type of place, as if they were discovering a distant land, and they even speak of the customs, the mores of the poor or of foreigners, as if they were completely different from them, as if they were another race of people. And we'll see that the word race is very often used by these urban explorers to refer to the poor. The poor are considered to be another race. So, yes, the city as a dark, mysterious maze, as a dark, mysterious labyrinth, in a way. Well, we'll come back to this essay by Judith Wilkowitz. Well, you'll have to read it on your own. It's really crucial to understand the course. I don't want to dwell on it just now, but we'll come back to several of its passages later. And now we'll pass to, well, what I want to study this week and for the next 2 weeks, that is the study of immigration in the Victorian period, and especially how the alien, as it was called, was represented. But before being able to understand and to analyze the representation of aliens in the 19th century, of course you need to have a kind of historical background on immigration during the Victorian period and how mostly the different types of immigrants were perceived at the time. So first, immigration in the Victorian period was made possible by Victoria's policy, which was called an open doors policy. An open doors policy concerning immigration, due to the status of Britain at the time. It was a colonial empire. It was the greatest colonial empire on earth at the time. It was the workshop of the world, as I've already said, and it seemed absolutely natural, absolutely normal, that all immigrants should be accepted into Britain. Britain was seen as a kind of mother country, if you want. You remember the... no, it's not with you that I studied this picture, so you don't remember it. But Britain was obviously seen as the protector. It was seen as the powerful country which was here to protect weaker countries. It was... it considered itself as a kind of nervous center, as a kind of brain, if you want, a kind of nervous center, a kind of brain, and its role, they thought, was to activate their limbs, represented by the other countries. You see, the arms and legs of the British Empire were the other countries, especially the colonies, and they were the nervous centers. They were the ones who thought. They were the ones who gave directions. They were the ones who, yes, who issued directions to the limbs. The others were just executing what the orders were like. This is very well rendered, by the way, by, I've included it at the end of this fascicule, by the map, the plan of the Great Exhibition. This is the ground floor and the upper floor of the Great Exhibition in 1851. And when you look at it, you will see that, well, the British exhibits were more or less situated here, that is, in the middle of each ground, and all around, as if it was the nervous center, the brain, if you want, and all around there were the different colonies and the other countries of the world. And this represented, symbolically at least, this represented exactly what the British thought they were at the time, a kind of benevolent mother or father with its children all around. And to the British at the time, the mission was to civilize all these countries, especially the colonies. So they had this civilizing mission, as they thought, a very paternalistic approach to this civilizing mission, and this is what the colonial spirit was, that is, civilize, that is, imposing one's own civilization on another people. So this plan represents this idea of the brain and the limbs, the ones who think and take the decisions, and the ones who do act, execute decisions. Right. So, because of this open doors policy, because the country was wealthy, because the country in the second part of the century, many people came to Britain. There were, of course, European immigrants, Germans, Italians, French people, but most of the time these Italian, German, French refugees were wealthy people, or people who had a trade and very, very, well, they could integrate into British society very easily. So they were not a problem to the rest of the population, in a way. But Britain also attracted other groups of immigrants whose integration was much more problematic, and we'll focus on these groups and the way they were perceived by the Victorian population. Well, the first group of immigrants in the Victorian period is Jewish immigrants. Jewish immigrants, the Jews had been banned from Britain, or from England, rather, at the time, between the 13th and the 17th century, completely banned. Doesn't mean that there were no Jews left in Britain, but they had been banned from England, at the time, from England. And it's only in the 17th century that the Jews could go back to Britain. And there were several influxes of Jewish people into Britain in the 18th century. And most of the Jews who settled down in Britain in the 18th, 17th and 18th century, when they were allowed to return to Britain after this long interruption, most of them became very wealthy, and they were well integrated into British society. So they did not represent a community that was particularly criticized. Well, of course, there were cliches about them, but they did not suffer from any type of particular discrimination, but simply because they were wealthy, and simply because people coped with them because they were wealthy, very simply. What interests us is, of course, the 19th century. And in the 19th century, in Victorian England, England was the second destination for Jewish people coming from Poland and Russia, most of them. They escaped what was called the pogroms, that is persecutions in Poland, in Russia. Many of them were doctors, intellectuals, etc. And they were persecuted at home in Poland, in Russia, and they tried to escape. So their first destination was the United States, of course, but the second destination was England, and very often to go to the United States, they stopped first in England, and some of them, even if initially they meant to go to the United States, stayed in England. So these Jewish Poles or Russians arrived mostly in London, but also in Leeds, in Manchester, so there were several cities in the country where they came. But this time, the great difference with pogrom, vous savez pas ce que ça veut dire? C'est ça? Non? Ah, pogrom, P-O-G-R-O-M. Pogrom, c'est les persécutions pour des raisons politiques, etc. So the big difference between the Jewish immigration of the 18th century and the Jewish immigration of the 19th century was that most of the Jewish people who arrived massively in the 19th century were poor. They were not wealthy people as in the 18th century. And when they arrived in Britain, they immediately had a more negative image a more negative image, and very, very oddly, in a way, and very sadly, they were especially rejected by the Jewish community already in place. Not all of them, but they were afraid. They had, you know, the Jewish community that had settled down in the 18th century, etc. Well, they had become respectable families, wealthy families for most of them, and they didn't want an influx of poor Jewish immigrants to tarnish their reputation in a way. So they were not particularly, well, many of them were not particularly welcoming to the new Jewish immigrants. Not all of them, of course, but a majority of them were a little reluctant to see poor Jews arrive in Britain. So when they arrived in Britain, these poor Jews, they thought that they would find freedom, they thought that they would find money if they worked hard, but they were faced with anti-Semitism very often. And when they arrived in Britain, they ran the risk of being abused by professional frauds. There was a phenomenon of white slavery at the time, and some professional frauds, of course, tried to welcome immigrants and tried to abuse them, and they became slaves, white slaves, as they were called at the time. So there was this danger when they arrived, especially when children arrived almost on their own without a family. So there was the danger of being abused, and there was, at the same time, on the other hand, a kind of a solidarity which started to build up, and some shelters were also built to welcome these poor Jews, and a part of the wealthy Jewish population tried to develop this solidarity, even if initially they were reluctant to receive these newly arrived poor immigrants from Poland and from Russia. The specificities of the Jewish immigration at the time, and it's important to understand their specificities. Each group had a specificity. And the specificity of the Jewish population at the time, those who arrived in the 19th century, is that most of them worked in workshops, dans des ateliers. Most of them worked in workshops or as tailors. Le fameux tailleur juif, c'est le cliché, ou c'était le cliché, mais effectivement, à l'époque, beaucoup de juifs s'étaient installés comme tailleurs dans l'East End de Londres, etc. So they worked in workshops, or they worked as tailors. They were considered to be very docile workers. They were considered to be hard workers, and they were considered to be ready to work 15 hours a day, for instance, even for a very low wage. It was the time of the, you remember I told you last time, the sweating system. The sweating system in which you worked sometimes 15 hours a day, including children sometimes, and you had absolutely no protection and you earned very little money. But the Jewish population at the time was known, which doesn't mean that all the Jewish people acted like this, but it was known, it was perceived as a population which was hardworking, docile, ready to work long hours for almost nothing, and having a decent life, as was said at the time. That is, educating their children in the right way, considering that the family was an important value. And this, in a way, was something that was positive for the Victorians. The place that the Jewish family had, for instance, the values that they taught their children, etc. So, generally speaking, even if there was obvious anti-Semitism in some reactions, they were considered in quite positive
terms. Because they were docile, because they worked a lot, because it was considered to be a peaceful population, and especially a law-abiding population, that is, a population respecting the law, abiding by the law. And when you read different testimonies from the time, and we're going to read some extracts, when you read different testimonies from the time, it's true that many urban explorers stressed this docility, this hard-working life, and all in all, when, for instance, a generation of Jewish people arrived in London and lived this life of hard work, working 15 hours a day, sometimes more, for almost nothing, generally the next generation could move from the poorer quarters and settle down in the suburbs, for instance, and enter the middle class or lower middle class, and then sometimes even rise in the social ladder. So there was obviously a social integration which was quite recurrent in this community, or at least this is how they were perceived by most Victorian explorers and by most Victorian observers. For instance, I have selected one text about the way the Jews or the Jewish immigrants were considered at the time. If you take the first text I've included for this part of the course, well, once again, it's well, this time it's by George Sims, another journalist and urban explorers. It dates back to 1906, that is the Edwardian period this time, and yeah, and you have yeah, the story. No, it's not here. Yeah. We recognize the Jewish shelter. Look at the little group. Say to yourself, more alien immigrants, and perhaps pass on. But if we go around to the back of the house, we find ourselves in a narrow street, which ends in a dead wall. And in this street, standing 4 deep in a line that stretches right away to the wall itself, are hundreds of the soldiers of the Tsar. They are all Jews. They have all escaped from Russia at the risk of their lives. Most of them had only a few rubles in their pockets, but they have come from Russia, some even from Manchuria, and they are here tonight in the quiet, deserted London street, waiting their turn to go before the committee, which is sitting in the big room of the shelter, to hear their stories and see what can be done to help them to make a new home thousands of miles away from the seas. Well, even here, in the way he starts describing this Jewish Russian population, what kind of impression do we have? What is an adjective which is particularly telling here? They are said to be
Heroic. Heroic.
Well, heroic, yes, so this is positive, but also quiet. The atmosphere seems to be quiet, it's not noisy, it's not... So this seems to be quite positive initially from the beginning. Then, well, there are policemen to make sure that everything looks right. These hunted men, fresh from a land of tyranny, are silent, cowed, incapable of anything but the blindest obedience to the authority of the land to which they have fled, seeking a city of refuge. So it's this notion of docility, as if they're I would say their background, the country they came from, the city of tyranny, and you see how he opposes London, the city of refuge, and Russia, the land of tyranny. But once again, something very, very positive in the sense that they don't seem to be dangerous, they don't seem to be threatening to him. Then none of the refugees speak a word of English. Yiddish, the German Yiddish jargon is their mother tongue. Most of them speak a little Russian. Then speaking of an inspector, and yeah, they have not yet learned that in England no one in authority will knock them about or kick them. If they were so used, they would not show any resentment. It is the way in which they have been habitually treated in Russia. Sometimes one of their own number, placed in temporary authority to assist the staff of the shelter, clears a way for someone to pass by, thrusting his compatriots back with a little violence. He does not understand that there is anything unusual in this method of giving an order. When it is explained to him that in England we don't lay hands upon peaceable people in this way, he is astonished. What a wonderful country. The great people don't knock a poor Jew off the footpath. They speak to him civilly. It takes a newly arrived Russian Jew many days to understand that he's going to be treated like a human being and that even the police will not kick him or hit him on the head if he's unfortunate enough to be in the way. What do you think of this passage? What does it show about George Sims?
They were being abused when they were in Russia, but when they got in England, they came to this term that England is their, like heaven.
Yeah, like heaven. Was it the truth, according to you?
I don't know.
Not completely, of course, not completely. The fact that no policeman would hurt an immigrant in Victorian London, I'm not sure that was the case, you see. So, but of course, George Sims here speaks as a patriot. To him, London is the city of refuge. The British government is an example of democracy, and of course, the situation was much different in Russia. Obviously, this was a country of peace, while Russia was not. But the way he introduces this, is, of course, quite exaggerated, probably, or he idealizes the situation in Britain, obviously, even if, of course, it was much better than in Russia. So you see here the way he is othering the Jews that he describes, the Jewish Russians that he describes here, is that, for instance, he says they are crowded together. Not a sound comes from their lips. They look like statues of despair. Their one feeling is of relief that they are now inside the shelter, and so their chance of getting before the committee tonight is better. You see that, as is very often the case, the urban explorer, George Sims here, others these people by representing them as a crowd. You see, they do not appear as individuals with a name, with particular characteristics. They are seen as a crowd. They are seen as if they all looked the same. They look like statues. There's almost something inhuman in them. Because, and this is what he would like us to think, because they come from a country which is inhuman, which was inhuman. But now that they are in London, the cradle of civilization and the cradle of peace, they should become more human. So at the same time, it's a description of immigrants which is not negative at all. He rather pities the experience that they went through, in a way. And he considers that they went through so much that it's difficult for them to understand what peace means. But at the same time, he still others these people, these immigrants, considering them different from him. In the way he speaks of them as a mass of people, a crowd of people, and in the way he compares them to a motionless crowd or statues of despair. So this is quite typical of the descriptions of the Jews. Look at another description, this time a scene in the street. Let us leave these unhappy ones massed together in quiet street, in crowded yard and in the packed room, and pass into another room in which the committee are now sitting. As they will sit on far into the night, examining every man in turn as to his trade, his means, his prospect of earning a living, if room is found for him in one of the ships which the sympathy and philanthropy of their co-religionists have secured for these poor wandering Jews. Let us sit as one of the long deal tables at which members of the committee are cross-examining the applicants. So it's not in the street, it's still the committee. he's going to focus on some people this time. A squarely built man of about 30, pale, haggard, with a hunted look in his eyes, comes forward. He tells his story. He's a builder of wooden houses. He had served his time. He had been home, but for a few weeks, when he was ordered to rejoin. He talks the matter over with some fellow reservists, and then he tells the story. He stands before us in London tonight, waiting to know where the committee can send him for the rubles which he still has left. He receives a ticket for a ship leaving for Canada, drops a knee in the Russian manner of salutation, and goes forth gleefully into the street to think out the future in the London lamplight. So here again, quite idealized London as the future, a future of peace. And later in the text, where is it? There are men in the city of London engaged in large businesses and employing hundreds of Christian hands in manufactures not previously carried on in England. And these men came from Russia and Poland, poor persecuted Jews, but with a few shillings in the world to call their own. If I were to make a list of the big Jewish manufacturers and tradesmen and Jewish men of learning and of science who came to this country, poor alien immigrants, the revelation would be an astounding one. What do you feel here? What kind of feeling does he express? Which you won't find at all in accounts, for instance, on Irish immigrants. In this sentence especially. There's a feeling of...
Two types of Jewish people that came to the British.
No, what it means is that they may come as poor alien immigrants, but in a generation or the next,
They become rich.
they'll become, maybe not rich, but they'll become very respectable people. So there's a kind of admiration, in fact, an admiration about the way these Jewish immigrants manage, in spite of the difficulties, in spite of what they've been through, in spite of the way they live initially when they arrive in Britain, because they live a poor man's life, that they still manage to get by, and that they become, or they're going to become, a very respectable community, maybe in the next generation. So all the different references that he makes here are rather positive as far as his perception of Jewish immigrants is concerned. He insists on the fact that the other Jewish people already living in London are going to help them. So he insists on the solidarity, which is going to be, even if some of them were reluctant initially, then they are going to try to help these new immigrants. He is insisting on the fact that their stories are pitiful stories, that they've been through a lot, that of course they have lost their humanity in a way, but it doesn't mean that they are inhuman. It just means that because of what they've been through, they are now almost inhuman. But thanks to London, thanks to Britain, they would be able to live a decent life. So all this is a rather quite positive perception of the Jewish immigrants. And I'm insisting on this, and it's not, well, I've taken one text, so we can't generalize from one text, but this text is very characteristic of most descriptions of the Jewish population, of the Jewish immigrants of the time. Very often you will see descriptions of Jewish people as law-abiding citizens, raising their families in the morality that was so dear to the Victorian people, etc., etc. The second community, I don't like the word community, but I'm using it to say that they were considered to be a community. The second great community of immigrants in the Victorian period were the Irish. And you will see that the way the Irish were perceived is completely different from the way the Jews were perceived at the time. The Irish immigrants, well, Irish immigration was the most important source of immigration to England between the Middle Ages and the 20th century. But the greatest flows of immigration occurred in the 18th century for political, religious reasons, and especially in the mid-19th century due to the potato famine, the Great Famine, as it was called. That is, this time for economic reasons. And once again, there was a difference between those who had left Ireland in the 18th century for political or religious reasons. Most of them were quite well integrated. They were quite wealthy, and they were quite well integrated into the British society. But the poor Irish people who left Ireland because they simply they were simply hungry because of the potato famine, well, their reception was very different. And the same happened as with the Jewish population. That is, the fact that the Irish population, the respectable, or considered to be respectable, Irish population which had settled down in England, in Britain, in the 18th century, and which was well integrated, well, was quite reluctant to see this influx of poor Irish people, because they knew that this would mean another image for the Irish community. And so there was this reluctance, even if, of course, again, later, some of them helped the poorer people. So, I'm not going to speak of the Great Famine, but it was a very harsh period, a period of hardship for Ireland. Ireland was still, at the time, in the mid-19th century, a very rural country, and its only crop, its main crop, was potatoes. So when your whole country is based on one crop in particular, and when this crop fails, you may imagine the impact on the country. And of course, the poorest suffered the most, and they are the people who massively tried to escape Ireland, to find a job elsewhere, and to try to save their family. But one of the exodus was in the middle of winter, and many people died. Very often they went on foot, that is, they walked to England, and many of them died, and there were many diseases, so many dead at the time. The Irish settled down in different places in England, in London, but in other cities, in other towns, in ports especially, and also in the countryside. Contrary to Jewish immigrants, their perception was very negative, really very negative. For instance, when they lived in the countryside, very often they lived in pigsties with the pigs, with the cows or the pigs. They were considered to deserve nothing more than a pigsty. At the time, there was also a kind of legend or a kind of story which parents used to frighten their children when they were naughty. And it was the story of the naughty Irishman who was going to come and pick them if they were naughty. And this used to frighten children. The naughty Irishman was a kind of legend which frightened children at the time. They were criticized for working hard for very low wages, but at the same time, that is, English people, they also said so about Jewish people. They didn't like the idea that some people, mainly immigrants, Jewish immigrants, Irish immigrants, accepted to work 15 hours a day for a very small amount of money. Because it was the time when trade unions started to fight for better work conditions. So they considered that if some people accepted to work in these conditions, then the trade unions would never manage to have pay rises for the other people. So there was a kind of dissension on this point. But at the same time, and this was very contradictory, English people considered that the Irish people were very lazy. They were considered to be lazy. They were considered to be dirty. They were considered to be inferior human beings. Very often in the caricatures of the time, I'm going to show you some, they were associated with monkeys, apes, monkeys. And whether you take American caricatures or British characters of the time, generally an Irishman was represented with a face of a monkey, with a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a bomb under his arm. So he was considered to be a potential terrorist. Irish terrorism started to, the birth of the IRA or of the nationalist movements started at the time. So there was this notion that the Irish as terrorists, the Irish as a drunk, always with a bottle of whiskey. Well, this is how they were represented. And the Irish as an inferior human being. The Celtic race, as it was called, was considered to be much inferior to the Anglo-Saxon race. Generally, on the scale of evolution, you know, after Darwin's theory, the Anglo-Saxon was put at the top, and then there was the black man or the Irish man, it all depended, and then you had the monkey. This is how they represented the evolution of man. From the monkey to the Anglo-Saxon being, of course, the main, almost a god, and in between you had the black man or the Irish man. I've included, I think, some of these. Oh, sorry. This is not what I wanted to do. Non, je peut-être pas. So this is typically an Irishman, of how he was represented. The Irish Frankenstein, as it's called. And you see the way he's represented as not only apish, obviously, looks like an ape, the way he's standing like this. But he also looks like what, if you see his size.
A thief?
A thief, of course, yes, but also if you see his size as opposed to the British gentleman.
Giant.
Monster.
Giant, a monster, yes. So he's the giant, he's the monster. He's the English Frankenstein with a reference to Frankenstein, especially not Frankenstein, but Frankenstein's monster. You have this notion of the strangely mixed monster, exactly as Henry James called London. And you see how the British gentleman seems to be afraid of him. He seems to be threatened by this Irish Frankenstein, who is ready to stab him with his knife. You see? Typical representation of an Irishman. Another typical representation is this one. Here, the Irish people. What do they look like, once again?
Apes.
Apes, once again, yes. In rags, kinds of rags, so dirty. And also, do they look pleasant? No, also threatening, obviously. And you see the ambivalence in people's feelings at the time. You have the Irish crowd here, apish faces, threatening attitude. And here you have two women. Who do they represent, these two women?
The left one represents Britain.
Yeah, this one is Britain. She's almost a man-like woman, in the sense that, especially at the time, in terms of how men and women were considered at the time, this one seems to be strong or weak? Strong, very strong. She seems to be the protector. And this is why she has almost a manly attitude. She's strong. This is how men were supposed to be.
And also
She's called Britannia.
And it also has the notion of terrorism, because the Irishman is, holding his hand on his coat to try to put something out, and the Britain is fisting his,
Yeah, absolutely. She's ready to
to fight, absolutely. And here, this much more feminine representation is, and it is very positive in a way.
The Jewish one?
No, she's Ireland, she's Hibernia. Hibernia. And there was this ambivalence in Britain towards Ireland. Ireland was considered to be the little sister of Britain, and this is very obvious here. Britannia is protecting Hibernia. She seems to be protecting Hibernia from her own people, if you want. So there was this vision of Ireland as the idealized little, weak little sister, fragile little sister that Britannia wanted to protect. Once again, this idea of the mother country protecting its colonies, in a way. Ireland was not a colony in itself, but you see what I mean. So, protecting Hibernia, but at the same time despising the Irish people, and especially the peasants, and especially the ones who wanted their independence, etc., etc. Well, not their independence, but wanted to stress their nationality, their Irishness, if you want, right? So a completely ambivalent representation of Ireland in general. Ireland as the little sister, the weak little sister that Hibernia as the weak little sister that Britannia is going to protect, and the Irish people as a dangerous people. Another representation, this one, exactly the same type of representation of the Irish, same time of perception of the Irish. Here, it's the Irish Tempest. It's a reference to Shakespeare, the Tempest. Which character of the Tempest represents the Irish? Have you read Tempest? No. Well, there's a monster in the Tempest, and of course the monster called Caliban. Caliban, he's a monster. Yeah, he's a monster, a poor monster, but a monster. And well, the Irish is typically Caliban, whereas the ones representing British people who seem to be completely afraid, especially the woman, of course, who seem to be completely afraid by the Irishman, represent a magician, Prospero, in the Tempest, and his daughter, Miranda, if I remember well. I'm not sure about Miranda. But I guess it's Miranda. So once again, exactly the same representation. So this is the typical representation of Irish people at the time. It's almost always the case. Well, this one is different. You find, on the contrary, very few representations, caricatures of Jewish people. Some of them, but I really tried to find as many caricatures of the time in Punch magazine. I could find caricatures of African people, of Asian people, of Irish people, a lot of them, but very few of Jewish people. It doesn't mean that there was no anti-Semitism, but it means that they were not considered as inferior as the Irish or the Asians or the Africans were. The anti-Irish sentiment was fueled by different factors. First, the Irish people certainly took more time to escape poverty and rise to the middle class. A long time. It took them rather 3-4 generations to manage this, whereas among the Jewish community generally it took 1 generation. It's an average, of course, but there was a difference between the two. And in a way they were despised for this. They were considered backward, primitive people. And if they were considered backward, primitive people, exactly as Africans or Asians were considered backwards and primitive people at the time, it was simply because they didn't have the same type of civilization, and they had not undergone the Industrial Revolution. And the British at the time thought that the Industrial Revolution meant that you were intellectually superior to the other peoples.
They forgot that some civilizations were much more ancient than the British civilization. So first they were considered primitive, backward. Second, they were taught by pseudo-scientists that the Celtic race was inferior to the Anglo-Saxon race. So in scientific studies of the time, you had, well, I can show you an example. Well, it's not about, but I've not found one with an Irish man, but it's exactly the same for Irish people. So you can, I used it here. If you take, for instance, this pseudo, c'est ça qui vous gêne?
Oui. Moi j'avais écrit, j'avais pas me dire.
Voilà par exemple, voilà par exemple typique, ça. Hein, je vous l'avais montré la semaine dernière, non celle-là, non pas vous. Je sais plus parce qu'il y a un autre cours où je reprends certaines, c'est pas le même cours du tout, mais il y a quelques images que je reprends. Yeah, so this is typical of the pseudo-scientific pictures published in scientific magazines at the time. So you see, this is very, well, a list of the species of men, considering, or of species, considering that the ape is the first stage of, the first phase of man. The Anglo-Saxon man, he doesn't look even like a man, by the way, but the Anglo-Saxon man is the top of the ladder. And in between, well, here he's a black man, but he could be an Irishman. Sometimes it was an Irishman. And you see how they try to make us believe that the form of the skull of the ape was very close to the form of the skull of the black man. And they completely transformed the form of the skull of the white man to make him look like a very distant from, but he doesn't look like a human being like this, you see? So, but it was just because they analyzed the cranial features and but this is how racism was born, of course, because they were scientists who published such pictures and who demonstrated in very scientific terms that it was absolutely normal that, for instance, black people were slaves because they were inferior beings, or that Irish people were slaves, not slaves, but laborers because they were inferior beings. Another one is very telling as well. It's this one. So you see the chimpanzee, the black man, and the Anglo-Saxon doesn't even look like a human being. Once again, he seems to be a statue of Apollo. So you see well, this is the Anglo-Saxon, the god, and these are the lower races, as they said at the time. And of course, all the cliches, all the stereotypes that are still used today come from this. Quand Madame Taubira, on l'a traité de singe, je ne sais plus comment on lui avait dit, ben ça vient de là, hein, ça vient de ces choses-là qui sont restées dans les mémoires. Et regardez, par exemple, j'avais montré ça à ces étudiants, regardez, voilà, regardez une description, voilà. Ça, c'est un extrait d'un scientifique de l'époque. We have already seen that various leading animal forms represent stages in the embryonic progress of the highest, the human being. Our brain goes through the various stages of a fish's, a reptile's, and a mammifer's brain, and finally becomes human. Alors, bon, à l'époque, c'est ce qu'on croyait. There is more than this, for after completing the animal transformations, it passes through the characters in which it appears in the Negro, Malay, American, alors American, il veut dire Indian, les Indiens d'Amérique, Mongolian nations, and finally is Caucasian. Donc en gros, on commence, l'évolution, elle part d'un poisson, après un reptile, un mammifère, et après ça devient un homme, mais il dit, à l'intérieur de l'humanité, il passe déjà par le stade of the Negro, hein, comme on l'appelait à l'époque, après le Malay, je ne sais pas pourquoi le malaisien là-dedans, il y arrive, après l'Indien d'Amérique,
après le mongolien, je ne sais pas non plus pourquoi, mais enfin bref, et ensuite le caucasien. Alors je ne sais pas où vous mettez les Irlandais, là, dans le blanc. Et regardez ensuite ce qui est écrit, mais ça c'était présenté. Comment voulez-vous qu'un peuple qui lit ça comme étant la vérité scientifique n'y croit pas? C'est difficile, hein. C'est pour ça qu'il faut... J'insiste toujours là-dessus, parce que quand on dit les Victoriens étaient racistes, oui, selon nos propres standards, ils étaient racistes, bien sûr. Mais est-ce qu'on peut les accuser d'avoir été racistes, selon nos propres standards, quand on leur présentait ça comme étant la vérité scientifique, démontrée par des scientifiques? C'est difficile, hein. On ne sait pas comment on réagirait, nous, si on nous présentait des études scientifiques nous disant des choses complètement fausses, mais c'est pas évident. Je ne les excuse en rien, mais je veux dire, il faut remettre les choses dans leur contexte avant de juger par nos propres... Donc voilà, the leading characters in short of the various races of mankind are simply representations of particular stages in the development of the highest or Caucasian type. The Negro exhibits permanently the imperfect brain, projecting lower jaw and slender bent limbs of the Caucasian child, some considerable time before he is born. Donc en gros, l'homme noir, selon ces pseudo-scientifiques, il est l'équivalent de l'embryon de l'homme caucasien, hein, au niveau intellectuel, etc. Ensuite, l'Indien américain, lui, il est juste avant la naissance. Il n'est pas bien placé. Le Mongolian, lui, il est an arrested infant newly born. Donc en gros, il vient de naître, mais il s'est arrêté là. Et puis ensuite, il y a, bien entendu, l'anglo-saxon, etc., etc. Et lisez aussi ça, que je trouve assez incroyable, parce que c'est quand même quelqu'un qui s'est battu contre l'esclavage. Et regardez ce que quelqu'un qui s'est battu contre l'esclavage écrivait, donc toujours ces mêmes époques. It may be quite true that some Negroes are better than some white men. Ça, c'était déjà beau de le dire. But no rational man, cognizant of the facts, believes that the average Negro is the equal, still less the superior, of the average white man. And if this be true, it is simply incredible that when all his disabilities are removed, and our prognathous relative has a fair field and no favor, as well as no oppressor, he will be able to compete successfully with his bigger brain and smaller jawed rival in a contest which is to be carried on by thoughts and not by bites. The highest places in the hierarchy of civilization will assuredly not be within the reach of our dusky cousins, though it is by no means necessary that they should be restricted to the lowest. Et ça, c'est le discours d'un abolitionniste. Donc, qu'est-ce qu'il considère? C'est que même si on sort l'homme noir de l'esclavage, et le pire, je trouve, c'est il n'arrivera jamais à s'en sortir dans un monde où on doit réfléchir et non pas mordre. Donc, c'est vraiment l'association de l'homme noir à un animal. C'est un animal. Donc ça, c'est des textes vraiment qui sont à... J'hésite toujours à les mettre dans mes fascicules, ça fait un peu bizarre, je mets un... Mais c'est important de les connaître, de voir pourquoi on en est arrivé là, d'une certaine manière. Ce sont des textes qu'il ne faut pas oublier, parce que c'est vraiment... Et là, c'est un abolitionniste, quelqu'un qui a voulu, qui s'est battu pour abolir l'esclavage, mais qui considérait malgré tout les Noirs comme des êtres inférieurs, qui ne méritaient peut-être pas d'être esclaves, mais qui étaient inférieurs. Donc ça remet en perspective beaucoup de choses. Okay, so let's go back to the Irish. Well, they were considered exactly as inferior as black people. So it was not a question of color here, but they were considered primitive and inferior. So we said they were considered backward, primitive. Many thought that the Celtic race was much inferior to the Anglo-Saxon race, and generally they positioned the Celtic race at the same level as the black race, the Negro race, as they called it. They were supposed to be drunkards, and as they were supposed to be drunkards, they were also supposed to be criminals, and probably one of their worst feature was that they were Catholics, and probably a lot of the resentment against Irish people came from the fact that they were Catholics, for most of them, at a time when anti-Catholicism was still very strong in England.
And at a time when it was thought, and it was the truth, by the way, that Catholic family had many children, as opposed to Protestant families, generally an average of 9 children at the time per family. And the fear was that one day, because they had so many children, there would be more Catholics in England than Protestants. So there was, and you know, this is very often used, or this is very often expressed as a fear today towards immigration, the fact that immigrants have more children. So if they have more children, one day they will overpower us, let's say. So this is a very typical way of reacting. And, of course, as I've said, political activism was very strong in Ireland at the time. And from a political point of view, I'm not going to enter the details, but from a political point of view, there were tensions between Ireland and Britain, which also reinforced this feeling, this anti-Irish feeling. So 2 communities, and Jewish and Irish, and 2 very different reactions, 2 very different 2 very different reactions to these population. I've included a text on the Irish population and the way it was perceived. It's a text by Henry Mayhew. It dates back to the mid-19th century. Henry Mayhew was a sociologist and a journalist, but a sociologist especially. And he wrote, I don't know how many volumes there are, but at least 10 or 20, a long series of volumes on London labour and the London poor. And it's quite fascinating to read this. Well, not the whole of it, because it's quite difficult to read and it's very, very long. But in fact what it did is that, well, it was probably one of the first sociologists to interview poor people. And he interviewed, for years and years, he interviewed poor people in the streets of London. All types of people, all the different trades of the time, all the different nationalities. And he wrote about these people, and he quoted these people in his study, which was very new at the time, to make poor people speak, to make them voice their feelings. It's almost the only, I would say it's almost the only text in which we have poor people speaking of their own situation, not being spoken about by male-educated bourgeois, white male-educated bourgeois, you see? And it's really crucial to read this when you study the Victorian period, because he interviews many different people and he makes them speak. He tries to render the way they speak, so sometimes it's difficult to understand because their grammar is not very good. Even, I'm not speaking of foreign people, I'm speaking of English people, but their English is not very good English. It's broken English. And you have testimonies, for instance, of a girl who sells watercress, du cresson, who sells watercress, and she's something like maybe 10 or 11, and she's been doing this since the age of 5, because generally children in the streets started working at the age of 5 in the streets. And she explains, for instance, that she has never left her street in all her life, so she's maybe 14, something like that. And she explains that she was born in this street. At the age of 5, well, her mother, her father probably worked in the street, just outside their home, selling watercress. When she was 5, well, she went to the street at the age of 5, and from probably 7 o'clock in the morning to maybe 7 o'clock in the evening, she sold watercress, so she didn't leave the street. And in the weekends, they were so tired that they didn't leave the street. And she explains to Henry Mayhew, for instance, that she knows that there is a park at the other end of the street and another street at the other end, but she's never been there. In 14 years, she has never left her street. And if I'm quoting this, it's to show you why this new visibility of the poor became so shocking for many Victorians in the second part of the 19th century. Because before, the poor, well, kept to themselves, if you want. They lived in a very restricted area, and they didn't leave the area. And when omnibuses started to develop, then they could move around the city, which made things different and which made them more visible. Right, so this is a text about Irish immigrants, the homes of the street Irish. Well, I'm not going to read the whole text, of course, but take, for instance, I think it's at the end. Yeah. Even the last paragraph. The one thing that struck me during my visit to this neighborhood was the apparent listlessness and lazy appearance of the people. The boys at play were the only beings who seemed to have any life in their actions. The women in their plaid shawls strolled along the pavements, stopping each friend for a chat, or joining some circle and leaning against the wall as though utterly deficient in energy. The men smoked, with their hands in their pockets, listening to the old crones talking, and only now and then grunting out a reply when a question was directly put to them. And yet it is curious that these people, who here seemed as inactive as Negroes, will perform the severest bodily labour, undertaking tasks that the English are almost unfitted for. To complete this account, I subjoin a brief description of the lodging houses resorted to by the Irish immigrants on their arrival in this country. So you see here a completely different perception. If you take the description, for instance, of the Jewish immigrants that we read in the first account, and generally accounts of the perception of Jewish immigrants insisted on the fact that they were hardworking, that they were docile, that they were etc. Here it's all the opposite. They seem to be lazy. They seem to be spending their lives in the streets. Well, he says it's surprising because we know that they do sometimes hard jobs. But what he sees, according to him, is a lazy type of life. And he insists, almost as lazy as Negroes. As if being a slave was being lazy, by the way. But this is the perception, the very negative perception that most people had about the Irish. And Henry Mayhew, the sociologist, is no exception to the rule. He's obviously influenced by the cliches that were circulated at the time about Irish people as a kind of primitive, lazy population who tried to profit from the system and who did not work hard enough to be respected by the English population. And the whole text, if you read the whole text, is about this, is about the kind of decadence of the Irish population, whereas the Jewish population is always stressed as being a population who is decent, who is law-abiding, etc., etc. So a very different perception. The next group of immigrants is the African immigrants. The presence of black people in England was not new in the 19th century. They had already been present from the very beginning, I would say. There was, for instance, even the presence of a black emperor coming from Libya, and there are traces of his presence in York in the 2nd century. So the presence of black people on English land or British land was not something new. But the actual beginning of the black presence, that is a more visible presence, was first the 16th century. And why the 16th century? Because simply it was the beginning of the slave trade. And if slavery is very often associated with American slavery, well, Britain was also part of the slave trade, and slavery existed in Britain until the 19th century. Well, I'm not going to I'm not going to dwell on the period of slavery, but mostly the slavery worked in the following way. Some black people, well, no, at the time of slavery, sorry. At the time of slavery, there was what was called the Atlantic slave trade. And this Atlantic slave trade was profitable for the British merchant, for the English merchants at the time. So they became very rich through capturing and selling Africans, and they sold them in the Caribbean islands and in the Americas. And the trade was supported by the British Crown, that is the British, the English and then British queens and kings supported this Atlantic slave. And because of this slave trade, some Africans were also brought into Britain. And when they were brought into Britain, most of them became servants. They became footmen, servants. Yeah. So the slave trade was called the triangular trade. Why triangular trade? Because it was based on 3 steps. First, you had British ships which brought goods to Africa. Africa needed some goods that were not produced in Africa, so the British brought goods to Africa. It was the first stage. Then, in exchange for these goods, they took African people and they brought them to the West Indies. And of course, you have to know that if they could take African people, it was because other African people sold them to the British. So the British are to be blamed, obviously, but there were also African people to be blamed in the trade, unfortunately. And the third step, once they had brought the African people in the West Indies, to the West Indies, in exchange for the slaves, they brought back rum, tobacco, and sugar. So the way for the British to buy rum, tobacco, and sugar, which they did not produce, was through this triangular slave trade. Well, it's, of course, a simplification of things, but this is how it works. And it's only in the 18th century, that some political activists started campaigning against slavery. And among those political activists who fought against slavery, there were black people, educated black people, which meant that some black people had managed to escape slavery at the time and to be able to be educated, either because, for instance, they had found a master who had sympathized with them and they had finally bought back their freedom and they could be educated later. But they were an exception. Most African people at the time in Britain were very, very poor. They were very poor. Their situation was very difficult. Some of them even tried to convert to Christianism to be better accepted. But this was not enough, obviously. And most of them were servants, musicians also, cooks, sailors. All they were pages. Vous savez, les pages. And you know why they were pages? And this is typical of another type of othering. It's because they were supposed to, to highlight the pale complexion of women. At the time, it was very fashionable for women to be very pale. To be very pale. It was a sign of their wealth, in a way. The paler you were, the wealthier you were supposed to be. So they tried to be as pale as possible. Well, a suntan was not fashionable at the time. And very often they choose, and you can find texts which explain this, in which they chose their African page, generally boys, choosing them for the color of their skin. And the darker they were, the better for them, because they considered that it was a way to highlight their pale complexion, you see. But it doesn't mean that these pages had the most awful situation, because they lived in a house. They lived in conditions that were probably better than most others, but still they were considered like a dog. You see, it's like the woman with a dog and trying to choose her dog to highlight her beauty or to highlight her style. Well, a black boy was chosen on the very same basis because of the color of his skin and because it would highlight the paleness of the woman's skin. You find many adverts of the 18th century, early 19th century, in which you have a master looking for a fugitive slave, exactly as in the United States. That is a slave who has escaped the master, and the type of adverts that were published in the newspapers at the time showed generally a black man with a collar, you know, as if it was a dog, and with a reward if you find them, exactly as you would give a reward if you find a dog which has escaped your home. So they were really considered. They were probably, I would say, as much as the Irish people, and probably more than the Irish people, they were reduced to the existence of animals for most of them, and they were looked upon very contemptuously by most people. Not all people, of course, but by most people. At the time, mixed marriages, for instance, were forbidden. And if a British woman married a black man, then she lost her nationality. She lost her British nationality at the time. Which was not the case if a white man married a black woman. But this is another story. It's a double discrimination, I would say. So, in the 19th century, there was an increasing number of black musicians. Well, slavery was abolished in 1833. So the period which we're interested in is a period when slavery had been abolished for about 50 years, let's say. And at the end of the 19th century, there were more and more black musicians, often street musicians, or actors. You know that actors at the time had a very low social rank. And in the great chain of being in the Renaissance, the actor was even, I think, below the black man in terms of hierarchy. And I think that below the actor was the gypsy. But I don't know why this order in particular, but I've already seen this in a representation of the great chain of being. So, black people were also very much exploited in freak shows. We're not going to develop this today, but we'll speak about this next time. And black people were othered probably even more than many other people. Well, as much as the Irish people. And I would like to just have a look at one type of othering which was very, very usual at the time. It was through advertising. And this one, well, some of you may have already studied this text, but this ad, this terrible ad, is typical of the time. When you look at it, it seems to be so cute, so Victorian, you know, with the flowers everywhere and two little boys playing together joyfully. Well, it's not as
innocent as this. You see, well, first the black boy is in an inferior position, obviously. The white boy appears as the protector. The protector. He's the one who guides the black boy. Second, you see how the white boy is dressed, whereas the black boy is naked, which puts him in an inferior position as well. And the white boy, I would say, protects himself from the black boy. He has his apron. He's just taking a bath. There's nothing dirty about this. But he seems to be thinking that all this blackness is going to wear away with the soap. And this is what happens. You see how surprised the little black boy is when he leaves his bath and he sees that thanks to Pear's soap, the soap of the queen, thanks to Pear's soap, he's now all white, except for his head. And symbolically this is important because the British people thought at the time that if black people were black, it was either because the sun shone too brightly in Africa, and once they would be in England, then they would become less dark. Well, this didn't happen. Or they thought sometimes that it was just dirt. So the way the soap used this common belief is particularly shocking for us today. But at the time it seemed so natural. But the other message is that the head, that is the brain, the soul of the little black boy, will never become white. That is, the white boy would still remain superior to the black boy. Even when he has been whitened, thanks to the soap, his soul, his brain, will never be white. This is the idea. A very colonial, imperial way of reasoning. But you had many, many advertisements like this one at the time, which were absolutely natural and not shocking at the time,
There was
which
one.
of course would not be accepted today.
There was one in China a few years ago.
Oh yeah, I remember this one. Yeah. So you see, this is characteristic of the way black people were thought of, and of the way the Victorians were very paternalistic towards them. This is a very paternalistic, in the very bad sense of the word, a very paternalistic vision of black people. Well, we'll continue on this point next week because there's much more to say about it.
J'ai une question. Oui. J'ai oublié d'aller chercher ma petite gommette ou ma carte étudiant et j'ai voulu y aller hier. Mais en fait, c'était juste
C'est
jusqu'au
jusqu'au
30 septembre.
Maintenant, mais allez.